Just a quick introduction to who I am. I'm Jim Cheshire. I'm by training a historian, but I work very closely with the conservation subject area of Lincoln. So you've seen Kathy and Lynn already speak today. There's some great papers over the last couple of days. A lot of the heritage has been about what we call intangible heritage, about interpretation of heritage, about communities. I suppose our end of the sector isn't necessarily engaged with the physicality and materiality of the heritage itself, so it's a slightly different approach. What I thought I'd do today is talk a little bit about how we approach this word impact through the REF 2014, a recent research audit, and talk about the specific methodology, which we do a lot of in-house. The image on the left there is a microscope slide times 100 of a tiny sliver of paint, and the green bit is under simulated daylight, the bluey bit is under UV light. The layers lower down are the older layers, and you can see the more granular textures of the paint. So if I get cursor to work, you can see these big lumps here. These are the earlier, cruder paints, and some of these bits fluoresce under UV light, so you can tell. So I'll talk a bit more about that methodology and how it's led to research and impact, and finish with a few comments on why I think impact could be a positive thing. Mainly because I think it offers opportunities for collaboration between higher education and the heritage sector. So the basis of the paper is a reflection on the so-called impact element in REF 2014. I'll talk briefly about that for those of us that didn't have to take part. It's an attempt to see the positive potential for the interaction between higher education and heritage sector through impact. Ask some questions about how the two sectors can best support each other, and think about how we can understand our mutual funding opportunities and constraints. So first of all, overview of impact. I'll be very quick because it's very boring. Secondly, overview of how we approached it, impact through one of our case studies, and then a reflection about some of the results and questions. So I've shamelessly nicked some slides off one of the hefty presentations. REF 2014, basically big government audit about the research that went on in higher education. That's the timetable, I'm not going to dwell on that. Panel D, Arts and Humanities, is mainly what we've been concerned with for the last couple of days. Look at the timetable, essentially we've had just over a year since the results. So we know what happened, we know the scores. This is the bit I'm talking about. Quality of research outputs. Every full-time academic was expected to produce 4 outputs. These were graded 1 star to 4 stars. We kind of expected that. This is about your infrastructure, how many PhD students you have, the opportunities for developing research. We kind of knew we were going to get that. This is relatively new. It's not new anymore, but it was new for REF 2014. There was a lot of whinging within HE about this category impact, but people had to get used to it because it constituted 20% of the score. And REF 2014 fixes your research income for the next 5 or 6 years. It's not a yearly thing. So it had major funding implications within higher education. Impact was defined very broadly. An effect on or change or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public policy, services, health, environment, quality of life. I've had so many academics who actually say, what's impact? Well, it's actually all sorts of different things. You can't define it simply. It's deliberately defined broadly. And we've now got some great kind of graphics done at King's College London based on impact. What is pertinent to us here is this grouping of stuff in this corner, because these categories here are basically where a lot of the heritage sector sits. So if we look at these units of assessment, I've cut the diagram for us here. These are panel D, these are all the ones in green down here. And you can see panel D actually situated at all of its claims for impact within the heritage sector. So point one, there's a big desire within the humanities, arts and humanities side of higher education to claim impacts within the heritage sector. Okay, just to move to Lincoln now and what we do here. The conservation subject area is part of the School of History and Heritage. We run 3 programs: BA Conservation, a graduate diploma in Conservation Studies. This is basically a conservation course, conversion course, which gives people an entry point into conservation, and the MA Conservation of Historic Objects. We also, interestingly, have an in-house research consultancy called Smith Conservation, and it's their work I really want to talk about today, because I think the activity of a small business gives us a different entry point into the heritage sector, which we haven't really talked about for the last couple of days. This is just a screen grab from their website. It's looking a bit tired now. We're commissioning a new one, which will be up and running in the next couple of months. But it gives you some idea of the kind of projects that we've worked on. It was based on the work of Ian and Mike Smith, who we trained originally. They went into English Heritage. They developed this methodology on architectural paint research. And now we have 3.5 research fellows, including Ian and Mike Smith, working as research consultants in a business. Now, this business is wholly owned by the University of Lincoln. We pay their salary, so it's very much the university's business, but we keep a separate brand. Now, what I'm going to do is run through how we articulated this, what they do in the context of impact case studies. But just to run through the research process, there are about 5 processes within the research process. 1, site visits and sampling. You go to a historic property, you look around you, you've got to have a rough idea of what you think's there first, because that tells you where you ought to take the paint samples from. Secondly, once you've taken your paint samples, the microscopic analysis reveals paint stratigraphy, the layers of paint. 3, you have the option then of further analysis, more hardcore scientific techniques like FTIR, SEM, which can identify particular minerals within the paints. Sometimes that's required by clients, sometimes it isn't. Fourthly, this is where I come in. I act as historical consultant for Smith. Taking this evidence and linking it back to the historical archival information, if available, is very powerful. And then the collation of the paint samples, lining it all up and thinking about how can we map out the historic interior from what we've got here. So to give you some examples of this, this is our colleague Paul Croft, this is the Sheldonian Theatre Oxford, and here Paul's doing the woodwork to get a paint sample. You have to take a lot of samples. You can see here this architrave, there's 8 samples taken from this, because there's a decent chance that there was a different decorative finish on each of those different mouldings. So this involves taking a lot of samples. And as you can see here, you have to very clearly record where the samples are taken from in order to map out the whole process. You can see the same sort of thing going along here. So lots of samples mapped out very carefully and taken with some knowledge of what to expect in the interior. The samples are then set in casting resin. The surface of the resin is then ground down and polished. And you can see here 7 or 8 paint samples set in a block. And to actually look at some samples, what you can see here, the grains here are actually the wood, so that's the grains of the wood. And in here, what we can see, you can see the bottom there better here, you can see that this cedar colour is actually applied directly to the wood, so there's no primer there. And as a result, the surface is actually degrading quite badly. But it shows if that's next to the wood, that was the first paint there. So we can be fairly sure that was the colour of the paint when the building was put up. This second example here is of this kind of guilloche moulding, which you can see when we came to the property was heavily gilded. What this sample shows is that layer 1 here was not gilded at all. This grey with streaks of red is an imitation marble finish. So we can show quite clearly that in this case there was no gilding on that sample. So these are the ways in which looking at the paint samples can transform the way we actually understand the materials. Now, the collation of paint samples arguably is even more important than the individual colours, because it's through mapping this information across loads of paint samples we can actually generate a map of the whole decorative schemes of the interiors. So this is a table based on Elizabeth Gaskell's house. which was reopened last year in Manchester. After mapping out all the paint samples from all the rooms, what we could do is actually get a real sense of, okay, this is the first scheme, this is a refresh of the first scheme. This scheme, which they dated to the early 1850s, is probably the first scheme that the Gaskell family actually established. This scheme, which they dated to the 1860s, turned out to be 1859, but they were pretty close there, was a later Gaskell redecoration. And so, through mapping out all this information, we can really gain quite a full idea of what's going on in these interiors. So, in terms of our impact case study, we took 4 projects, and we argued that our research sustained and enriched our cultural heritage, which leads to economic prosperity, cultural tourism, access to investment. The research had direct benefits to conservators, heritage managers, heritage visitors, and it helps organisations get grants. We were quite often involved in stage 1 HLF, where our research then led to a credible bid for stage 2 HLF, where they wanted to reinstitute historic schemes. So to just look at the projects quite briefly, Kenwood House, this was one of the most dramatic transformations that was a direct result of our research. One of English Heritage's flagship properties, kind of north of London. And just to demonstrate what happened, this was the library. Famous Robert Adam interior, one of the best Adam interiors around. This is how it was before we got to it. This is the process of the decoration. So this is what it looked like after the research. And just to underline that, a lot of this gilding we showed was actually post-Adam. So the difference between that's how it looks now with the scheme reinstated based on my Christmas research, and that's how it looked before. So in this case, there was really quite a radical rethink. If you're going to do that, you've got to be pretty sure of your material. So this is why actually going to interior decorative history, not from just documentary evidence, but from material evidence is really powerful. I mean, I'm a historian, so, it hurts me to say this, but if someone goes to Kenwood House, just after Adam's been there, and says, oh, it was all blue, he might have been wrong, or it might have been just how he was feeling that day. It doesn't give us that hard evidence to do something radical like this. But by using the paint stratigraphy, by going down to material evidence, using conservation methodologies, we can be pretty precise about what was actually there. Second example is with Gaskell's house. This is a lovely project. Gaskell's really interesting. I'm a Victorianist, so this really kind of pleased me. Gaskell's really interesting because of the way she uses interiors in her novels. She uses interiors to characterise some of the people in her novels, either as nouveau riche or sort of genteel, poor, or pretentious, or otherwise. And so how she actually decorated her own house is really, really interesting. I think everyone in Manchester was pleased with us because this is the colour the house was painted. This is the exterior. And we actually showed through paint research. It was actually a very kind of reserved, kind of fake stone finish interior, so that's what it looks like now. And within the house, again, you can see these paint samples. It's kind of fascinating stuff, so you can see layer upon layer of paint. This is a paint layer with a bit of varnish on top, so sometimes you didn't repaint, you just varnished. And so you talk to Paul Croft or Mike Smith, they can tell you all sorts of stuff from just looking at these surroundings. Sometimes there's no paint, which normally tells us there's wallpaper. And when the Gaskell interior has been taken apart, we found kind of layers of wallpaper. So there's also a kind of sense of wallpaper stratigraphy as well. And Linda Skipper, who's in the audience, has been using this as a methodology for looking at the interiors of the Middling Grand Hotel and St Pancras recently. So there are other kind of parallel techniques which we can use. Third example here. This is King's Garden, Southport, Merseyside, different sort of project because this was a massive regeneration project. And so this basically, they got a huge HLF grant, £4 million in 2012. Our research in the stage 1 process helped them gain credibility for this grant. And this was a kind of really interesting project. So there's a lot of kind of Edwardian cast iron structures that were central to putting the project back together in a credible way. These were really hard to actually find proper paint stratigraphy because they've been very aggressively stripped and cleaned. And one of the areas of cultural heritage that we keep on going on about is don't just strip back your walls, get a paint sample first, because if something's been stripped back mercilessly, you can't actually find the paint stratigraphy. Eventually, Paul Croft found a little sample just here, which showed what looked like an early stratigraphy. Then by going to a lot of the other cast iron structures right around the park, we eventually found a repeat of this, and this looked like a credible stratigraphy. And we passed this on to the architect, and then the architect is able to come up with a credible historic proposal for how these should look. He was a bit naughty actually, because all this stuff was taken from Paul Croft's report verbatim, and they didn't even cite us. Now that's kind of frustrating. Naughty, isn't it? But there you go. So heritage architects, conservation architects often don't have that much conservation expertise that they rely on people like us. Anyway, we don't mind. It was a great project and very, very successful. So that's, I think, giving you a sense of some of the work we did. This is very much doing heritage rather than reflecting on it or interpreting it. I guess a different kind of logic to a lot of what we've been talking about eventually. And I wanted really just to kind of reflect on where I got to. And I think some of these points have been covered already, but in my mind, humanities researchers tend to reserve the right to research what they want. You know, that's our last thing. We get to get interested in stuff and research it. That, I think, is problematic because it strikes me that if we just do our research, then try and make it impactful, it's never going to work. It's going to be a slightly hopeless process. So I think that's going to be under threat. I think, generally speaking, academics are not very good at creating impact themselves. That could be seen as a good thing or a bad thing. And I think if you don't really understand impact, you can spend time and money on it and it not really be very effective. Also, as we've come across, you know, grant-funded projects can get a kind of hit-and-run feel. You go in there, you're funded during your grant, and then you just disappear again. However, I think there's a lot of positive things about impact, and I'm personally very positive about it. We've got to remember it's a good thing. After all, if we don't have any impact beyond academia, we're just talking to ourselves. What are we doing? No one likes the bureaucracy, but we've got to remember impact itself is a good thing. From my experience, lots of heritage organisations already collect what we would think of as impact evidence. People, visitor figures, surveys, a lot of people do it anyway. So what this comes down to, turning this into a positive, we need to collaborate. And so I think impact, the need for impact, makes, you know, higher education's collaborations with the heritage sector absolutely crucial. So I think higher education's need for impact can lead to better funded and connected heritage community. I find it quite interesting how useful small business is within a university. When you obviously do commercial research, you're necessarily fulfilling a need. Someone puts up a tender, you respond to it. So the research obviously needs doing. So there's a natural path to impact there. And I tend to sound like a Tory when I'm kind of promoting the idea of small business within the university, but this Crick Smith as a business is not really there to make money. It's there to generate research income. It's there to create commercial projects which we can place our students on and enrich student experience. But it's also a far kind of more flexible and faster moving structure that we can use within the university. So arguably, commercially derived heritage research has a very clear contractual basis and no ambiguity around sustainability. That, not everyone would agree with that because obviously there's money involved, but there is a sense in which you know where you are with a commercially based project. This raises a few questions in my mind. You know, basically the top 2 points. How can higher education institutions find out what heritage organisations need in terms of research, and how can heritage organisations find out what the capabilities are? Now, interestingly, the Share Academy project earlier seemed to be doing just that. That was really intriguing. So it strikes me we need some sort of forum to communicate research needs capabilities across the sector. We have projects that are obviously aimed at this, but collaborative doctoral awards, partnerships, they're quite limited in scope because not all research needs a PhD with it. what can we learn from the commercial logic of research consultancy, and how can a small business operate effectively within a higher education institution. I mean, I'm promoting the business aspect here. It's actually quite hard to run alongside academia. If you have people who are half in the research consultancy, half in the academic team, a big job comes in, you can't just ditch all the students. You know, running things side by side is complicated. And just to finish on a slightly bizarre note, and this is purely to prove that impact is totally unpredictable, that bastion of academic knowledge, the Daily Mail, didn't like the way we advised the Royal Historic Dockyard, they didn't like the new colour of HMS Victory. And even more bizarre, a comment related to that. Do these interfering experts not realise what harm they have done? How many airfix or revel models of HMS Victory have applied with place in the mantelpiece to study the bedroom and homes around the world? All have to be repainted, because if the colours are wrong, it's not a replica scale anymore, but a bloody toy. Damn you, Michael Crick-Smith. Does you know how expensive those little tins of paint, model paint are, and how many hours of scale rigging is going to be destroyed? Make him walk the plank, or have him dragged across the barnacles, I say. Slightly strange note to finish on, but I guess it shows you just can't please everyone.